The war room aboard the orbital Citadel Pale Vigil had not been silent in over 1,000 years. But tonight, it was quiet enough to hear the hum of dying stars on the long-range sensors. High Concordant Ashaya stood at the center of the great table, her 4 silver eyes scanning the faces of the representatives from all 7 elder species of the Vithari hegemony. And what she saw in those faces was something she had never seen before in all her centuries of leadership: surrender. The Droon ambassador, a towering figure of living crystal, whose body usually pulsed with calm blue light, had gone dark, and his silence spoke louder than any words he could have offered. The Kelvari war commander sat rigid in her seat, her insectoid wings folded tight against her armored body, her compound eyes fixed on the holographic display that showed the advancing wall of red that was the Hollow Tide, the enemy that had been eating their galaxy alive for nearly 30 years. The Luron empath beside her was weeping openly, her translucent skin rippling with colors of grief that had no name in any language Ashaya knew. "Report," Ashaya said, and her voice did not tremble, though she felt it wanted to. War Commander Ithixis of the Kelvari rose and gestured at the display, and the red swarm pulsed closer with every refresh of the sensor data. "We have lost the Droon outer colonies," Ithixis said in her clicking, precise voice, "and the Sithani homeworld went silent 9 days ago. We believe it has been fully consumed. Our combined fleet strength is now at 22% of what it was at the start of the war, and we are losing ships faster than we can build them." Ashaya closed her eyes for a moment, and behind her eyelids she saw the faces of billions. The Sithani, a gentle people of weavers and poets, gone now, swallowed whole by the thing that came from between the galaxies. "Options," she said, was quiet again. "There are none," said Droon Vilos, the Droon philosopher general, his crystal body flickering with a dull amber that meant resignation. "We have deployed every weapon in our combined arsenal. Energy weapons, kinetic bombardment, biological agents, dimensional disruptors. The Hollow Tide adapts to each one within days, sometimes hours. It learns, it changes, it overcomes. We are fighting an enemy that becomes immune to everything we throw at it." "Then we find something we have not thrown," Ashaya said. "There is nothing left," Ithixis replied, and for the first time in all the years Ashaya had known her, the war commander sounded tired. Ashaya turned away from the table and walked to the great window that looked out over the stars, and she placed one hand against the cold glass and stared into the dark. She had been thinking about this for weeks, ever since the fall of the Mirathane system, ever since she had watched an entire civilization burn on her sensor displays, while she could do nothing but record their final transmissions. Quote, "There is one thing we have not tried," she said quietly. The room shifted behind her, and she felt their attention like a weight on her back. "The beacon," she said. The silence that followed was different from before. It was sharp, almost offended. "The beacon of last asking is a relic," Droon Velos said, his crystal form flashing with skeptical white. "It was left by a precursor race we know nothing about, buried in the core of a dead moon in neutral space. We do not even fully understand how it works." "We understand enough," Ashaya replied, turning back to face them. "It broadcasts a signal across every frequency, every medium, every dimension simultaneously. It was designed to reach every corner of this galaxy, and perhaps beyond. It is a call for help." "A call to whom?" asked the Luran empath, her voice thick with grief. "Felt the silence of the galaxy. Concordant, I have reached out with everything I am, and there is nothing out there. Every civilization we know of is either already part of this hegemony or already dead." "Then we call to those we do not know," Ashaya said. Iphixis ran calculations on her personal display, her antennae twitching rapidly as numbers cascaded across the screen. The probability of a response from an unknown spacefaring civilization is approximately 0.003%, she said. And the probability of our survival without one? HFY asked. Iphixis paused, and then her wings sagged. Lower, she admitted. The vote was not unanimous, but it did not need to be. HFY held emergency powers, and she used them now for the first and last time in her career. 3 days later, a small fleet of hegemony ships descended into the dead moon designated Anchor 9, and deep in its frozen core, they found the beacon. Structure of impossible geometry, built from materials that did not exist in any known periodic table, covered in writing that shifted and changed every time someone tried to read it. The engineers activated it with surprisingly little difficulty, as if it had been waiting. The beacon screamed. It screamed across radio waves and quantum channels and gravitational ripples and frequencies that the hegemony scientists could not even name. It screamed in mathematics and music and raw emotion. It screamed in every language that had ever been spoken and in patterns that were not language at all, but something deeper and more primal. Its message was simple, translated 1,000 different ways, but always meaning the same thing. We are dying. Is anyone there? And then it went silent, and the galaxy held its breath. Weeks passed, and nothing came back. No signal, no response, no acknowledgement from the dark between the stars. At the window of the pale vigil, every night, watching the sensor displays, watching the hollow tide creep closer. And she began to write extinction protocols, documents that would preserve the memory of 7 civilizations in hardened data vaults, scattered across the galaxy, so that whoever came after them would know they had existed. She was halfway through drafting the cultural archive of the Sithani, a people who could no longer speak for themselves, when the communications officer burst onto the bridge. "Concordant," the young Kelvari said, her wings trembling. "We have a response." HFY's hand froze over the document. "From whom?" she asked. "Unknown. The signal is crude, unencrypted, electromagnetic only. It is coming from a small yellow star system on the outer arm of the galaxy. There is no record of any spacefaring civilization in that region. We have no file on them at all." HFY moved to the communications console and brought up the signal, and it was indeed crude, messy, overlapping, broadcast on multiple frequencies at once, as if the sender was not sure which one would work, riddled with background noise and interference. But the message, when the translation systems finally decoded it, was clear. "We heard you. We are coming. Hold on." HFY stared at the origin point on the star map, a system catalogued only as Sol, orbiting an unremarkable yellow dwarf star at the edge of nowhere. No known civilization, no record of contact, no prior survey, nothing. And yet someone had answered. She read the message again, and then a third time, and something she had not felt in years moved in her chest, something warm and terrifying and fragile. "Hope," she whispered to no one in particular, her voice barely audible above the hum of the citadel. Ambassador Drun Calith had served the hegemony for 300 years, and in that time he had made first contact with 11 species, negotiated peace between warring civilizations, and once talked a rogue Kelvari fleet out of glassing an entire continent. Nothing in all those centuries had prepared him for humans. The diplomatic frigate dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Sol system, and the first thing Drun Calith saw on the sensor display made him ask his navigator to recalibrate the equipment. "It is calibrated correctly, Ambassador," the navigator said, her voice uncertain. The space around the 4th planet, a rusty red world the locals apparently called Mars, was filled with ships, and the word "filled" did not do it justice. There were thousands of them, and not a single one looked like any other. Sleek military vessels with angular hulls flew in formation beside blocky cargo haulers that had been welded with armor, plating and fitted with weapons that were clearly not part of their original design. There were ships that looked like they had been built yesterday, and ships that looked like they should have fallen apart a decade ago. One vessel appeared to be a civilian transport, with its passenger windows still visible, now sporting a pair of massive cannons bolted to its roof. "This is their fleet?" Drun Calith asked. "It appears so, Ambassador. It looks like a junkyard learned how to fly." He was escorted aboard the flagship of what the humans called the Terran Compact Navy, a heavy cruiser named TCNS Defiance, and he was met at the airlock by a woman who carried herself like she had been forged in a furnace and never fully cooled. Admiral Rena Vasquez was not tall by human standards, and she was certainly not tall by Drun standards, but she had a presence that made the air around her feel heavier. Her dark eyes were sharp and steady, and a long scar ran from her left temple down to her jaw, and she made no effort to hide it. "Ambassador," she said, extending her hand in what he had been briefed was a human greeting gesture. "Welcome aboard. We have been expecting you." Her grip was firm, and her skin was warm, almost uncomfortably so, and Drun Calith noted that humans ran at a core temperature that would indicate a moderate fever in most hegemony species. "Admiral Vasquez," he replied, "the hegemony is grateful for your response to our signal. We are eager to understand your capabilities and discuss how we might coordinate." "Good," she said. "Then show me what we are fighting." There was no preamble, no diplomatic ritual, no ceremonial exchange of cultural gifts. She simply wanted to see the enemy, and she wanted to see it now. They gathered in the Defiance's war room, a space that was functional and undecorated, and smelled faintly of coffee, a human stimulant drink that seemed to be present in every room on the ship. And Drun Calith activated the holographic projections he had brought. The hollow tide filled the room in miniature. Bioships kilometers long, their hulls made of living tissue that healed itself faster than weapons could damage it. Swarms of smaller organisms that moved like clouds of teeth. And behind them, the consumed worlds, stripped down to their mantles, turned into fuel and raw material for more ships and more swarms. He had shown these recordings to every species in the hegemony, and every time the reaction was the same. The Drun would go dim with despair. The Kelvhari would calculate and find the numbers unacceptable. The Luran would collapse under the emotional weight of so much death. Vasquez watched the entire presentation without moving, and when it was done she was quiet for a long moment, and then she nodded once. "Ugly things," she said. "How fast do they adapt?" "To energy weapons within hours, to kinetic weapons within days, to biological agents within a week at most. They learn from every engagement and become immune to whatever harmed them." "Do they learn from things that did not harm them?" Drun Calith paused. No one had ever asked that question before. "I am not certain," he admitted. Vasquez looked at her officers, and something passed between them. A look that Drun Calith could not read, but that seemed to carry an entire conversation in a single glance. "We have seen worse odds," she said calmly. "We just did not have spaceships at the time." Drun Calith spent the next several days aboard the Defiance, and each day he became more confused and more fascinated and more deeply unsettled by the species he was studying. He requested access to human historical records, and they gave it to him freely, with no censorship and no shame, and what he found in those records made his crystal body flash colors he did not know he could. These beings had fought 2 wars that spanned their entire world within a single generation. They had split the atom and immediately used it to destroy 2 cities. They had poisoned their own atmosphere, driven countless of their own companion species to extinction, enslaved each other, starved each other, and built weapons capable of ending all life on their planet several times over. And they had survived all of it. He ran projections using Drun analytical models, and the results were always the same. Humanity should have destroyed itself at least 12 times in the past 3 centuries alone. Their existence was a statistical impossibility, a rounding error in the mathematics of civilizational development. And yet here they were, building warships out of cargo haulers, and drinking their stimulant beverages and laughing in their mess halls, as if they were not about to fly into a war against a galaxy-eating parasite. He attended a briefing, where human military doctrine was explained, and he listened with growing bewilderment as officers described tactics built not on rigid planning, but on something they called commander's initiative, the idea that any officer at any level of command could make independent decisions based on the situation in front of them. "That is chaos," Drun Kalith said. "Yes," said Vasquez, and she smiled for the first time since they had met. "That is the point." She laid out humanity's strategy, not to overpower the hollow tide, not to outproduce it, not to develop a single ultimate weapon, but to never fight the same way twice, to deny the hollow tide any pattern to adapt to fill the battlefield with so much unpredictability that the enemy's greatest strength would become its greatest weakness. "Chaos is a ladder," she said, "and we have been climbing it since we came down from the trees." The Calvari War calculators reviewed the plan and gave humanity a 12% chance of surviving their first engagement with the hollow tide. Vasquez read the report and set it down on the table. "We have worked with less," she said. The combined fleet assembled in orbit around Mars. Hegemony warships gleaming and elegant beside human vessels that looked like they had been assembled in a hurry by very angry engineers. And together they began the long journey toward the front lines. On the last night before departure, Drun Kalith sat alone in his quarters aboard the Defiance, and composed a private report to High Concordant Eshaya. He wrote for a long time, and he deleted most of what he wrote, because he could not find the words in any of the 7 hegemony languages to describe what he had seen. In the end, he wrote simply, "They are reckless, contradictory, fragile, and absolutely unafraid. I do not understand them, but I believe they may be exactly what we need. They are not what we expected." Concordant. They are not ancient or wise or powerful. They are young and loud, and they break everything they touch, including themselves. But they do not stop. They have never stopped. And I am beginning to think that nothing in this galaxy can make them. The Charnel Line was not a place anyone wanted to be. It stretched across 40 light-years of dead space, a graveyard of broken hegemony ships and consumed worlds, where the wreckage of 100 failed offensives drifted in silence among the hollowed-out husks of planets that had once held billions of living beings. Captain Joaquin Herrera stood on the bridge of the TCNS Angry Wasp, a destroyer that had been a deep-sea mining support vessel 18 months ago, and still had the original company logo painted on its starboard hull, and he looked out at the field of debris ahead and felt his stomach tighten. "That is a lot of dead ships," said his first officer, Lieutenant Park, who had a gift for stating the obvious at exactly the wrong moment. "Focus on the live ones," Herrera replied. The combined fleet, 300 hegemony warships, and 412 human vessels of wildly varying size and quality, had dropped out of FTL at the edge of the Charnel Line, and the sensor displays were already screaming. The hollow tide vanguard was waiting for them. Tens of thousands of bioships, ranging in size from fighter-class organisms no bigger than a shuttle, to massive hive carriers that dwarfed even the largest hegemony battlecruisers. Their hulls were made of dark living tissue that pulsed with a sickly bioluminescence, and they moved not like ships, but like predators, circling and probing and testing. Admiral Vasquez's voice came over the fleet-wide channel from the Defiance, calm and clear, as if she were ordering breakfast. "All ships, this is Vasquez. Hegemony elements, execute defensive pattern Ithixis 7. Human elements, you know what to do. Fight smart, fight ugly, and do not let them see you coming. Good hunting." The hegemony ships moved with practiced precision, forming defensive arrays designed to maximize overlapping fields of fire. It was textbook, elegant, the product of centuries of military doctrine. The human ships scattered like a handful of gravel thrown into a pond. Herrera watched his tactical display as the 400 human vessels broke in every direction, each one executing a different plan, a different angle of attack, a different idea that had been discussed in mess halls and engine rooms and scribbled on napkins over cups of coffee. "Helm, take us into the swarm," Herrera said. "Sir, directly into it?" "That is what I said." The angry wasp surged forward, engines burning at maximum, heading straight for the densest concentration of hollow-tide organisms. And in the cargo bay, the engineering team was making final adjustments to a device that had never been intended for space combat. It was a deep-sea mining charge, a massive electromagnetic pulse device designed to shatter rock formations on ocean floors. And the engineers had spent the last 2 weeks modifying it to broadcast on frequencies that matched them. "Hollow Tide's bioelectric communication signals. Weapon is armed, Captain," the chief engineer reported over the intercom. "I want to say for the record that I have no idea if this will work." "Noted," Herrera said. "Fire it anyway." The angry wasp punched into the heart of the swarm, and for a terrible 3 seconds, the view screen was nothing but dark, pulsing flesh and bioluminescent eyes, and then the mining charge detonated. The effect was immediate and spectacular. A wave of electromagnetic disruption rippled outward through the swarm, and thousands of bioships shuddered and went still as their communication links were severed. They drifted, twitching, colliding with each other, suddenly blind and deaf and stupid. "It worked," Park said, and his voice cracked with disbelief. "Do not sound so surprised," Herrera said, though he was gripping the armrest of his chair hard enough to turn his knuckles white. Human ships were each executing their own version of this madness. The carrier group led by Captain Mira Osei launched 300 decoy drones broadcasting at maximum volume on every frequency the hollow tide used for coordination. The content of the broadcast was a playlist of human music selected specifically for its chaotic, aggressive, and rhythmically unpredictable nature. The hollow tide organisms, which communicated through resonance and harmonic patterns, could not process what they were receiving, and entire formations dissolved into confusion as death metal and free jazz and experimental electronic music flooded their sensory networks. A frigate called the TCNS Last Argument, commanded by a captain who had been a demolitions expert before the war, accelerated to maximum speed and rammed directly into the side of a hive carrier 10 times its size. The crew evacuated in escape pods 3 seconds before impact, and the frigate's reactor detonated inside the living ship, tearing it apart from within. A Marine boarding team from the TCNS Iron Promise landed on the surface of a bioship, actual humans in powered armor, walking on the skin of a living alien vessel. And they began cutting it apart with plasma torches and mining lasers, cauterizing its nerve clusters and severing its motor controls until the massive creature went limp and dead. The hegemony commanders watched all of this with a mixture of awe and horror. War Commander Athixis stood on the bridge of her flagship and stared at her tactical display, and her war calculators, the most advanced predictive combat computers in the hegemony, were flashing error messages because they could not model what the humans were doing. "This is not a strategy," she said. "No," said Droon Calith, who was observing from beside her, his crystal body pulsing with rapid shifts of color. "It is 400 strategies happening simultaneously, and none of them are the hollow tide could not adapt. It was designed to identify patterns and develop countermeasures, but there was no pattern here. Every human ship was a unique problem. Every attack was a one-time event. Every tactic was used once and then discarded in favor of something else entirely. For the first time in 30 years of war, the hollow tide vanguard broke. The bioships pulled back, not in an organized retreat, but in genuine confusion, scattering away from the battlefield in random directions, their coordination shattered, their adaptive intelligence overwhelmed by the sheer volume of contradictory data it was trying to process. The hegemony fleet channel erupted with transmissions in a dozen alien languages, and the translators could barely keep up. But the emotion was universal. Disbelief, elation, shock. "They are retreating," Ithixis said, and her voice was barely a whisper. "The hollow tide is retreating." On the bridge of the Defiance, Vasquez allowed herself one slow breath, and then opened the fleet channel. "All ships, pursue and destroy stragglers. Do not let them regroup. Good work, everyone." The battle was over in 6 hours, and when the final count came in, the results were staggering. Over 8,000 hollow tide organisms destroyed, including 3 hive carriers, the first significant hollow tide defeat in over a decade. But the cost was real. 17 human ships had been destroyed, some in their attacks, some caught by hollow tide organisms that had adapted just fast enough to strike back. Over 4,000 human sailors and marines were dead, their names already being compiled into lists that would be sent back to Earth. High Concordant Ishaya received the battle report aboard the Pale Vigil and immediately opened a channel to Admiral Vasquez. "Admiral, I must express my sorrow," she said, her 4 silver eyes dim with grief. 4,000 of your people. I am so sorry. This price is too high." Vasquez was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it, something heavy and old and carefully controlled. "Every one of them knew, Concordant," she said. "Every single one of them knew the price before they left home. Not one of them was ordered to be here. Every one of them volunteered." Ishaya did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing, and the 2 leaders sat in silence across the light years, connected by a thin beam of communication, mourning together. But deep in the dark spaces between the stars, something had taken notice. The queen mind of the hollow tide, the vast ancient intelligence that connected and directed the swarm across thousands of light years, had felt the vanguard die, and it had felt something it had not felt in millennia. These new creatures were different. They did not fight like the others. They did not follow rules. They could not be predicted. The queen mind turned its attention fully toward the newcomers, and it studied the recordings from the vanguard's final moments, and it felt something stir in the deepest and oldest parts of itself. Not anger, curiosity. The intelligence report arrived at 3 in the morning, ship time, and Admiral Vasquez read it standing in her quarters aboard the Defiance, with a cup of cold coffee in her hand. The hollow tide had changed course. For 30 years, the swarm had advanced in a broad, consuming wave across the galaxy, devouring everything in its path in a methodical and unstoppable march. But now, for the first time in the entire war, it had narrowed its focus to a single point. A massive fleet mass, larger than anything the hegemony had ever recorded, was moving at speed directly toward one star system, Sol. It was coming for Earth. Vasquez set down her coffee and opened a channel to the Pale Vigil. High Concordant Ishaya answered immediately, and her face was drawn with fear. "We have seen it," Ishaya said before Vasquez could speak. "The fleet mass is enormous. Our analysts estimate over 100,000 bioships, including at least 1 World Eater class organism. Admiral, the hegemony has prepared evacuation corridors. We can shelter your civilian population in Droon space. There is still time." "No," Vasquez said. "Admiral, please. The fleet mass heading for your world is larger than anything we have faced. You cannot." "I said no, Concordant. We do not run from our home. We have never run from our home." She closed the channel and opened one to every human ship and every military installation in the Sol system. "All hands, this is Vasquez. The hollow tide is coming to Earth. We have approximately 19 days before arrival. I want every weapon online, every ship in position, and every person who can hold a wrench building something that kills. We are going to make them regret choosing our front door. The Sol system transformed in 19 days from a bustling hub of human civilization into the most densely armed kill zone in galactic history. The asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter was seeded with proximity mines by the thousands. Old mining ships dragged asteroids into new orbits and packed them with explosives, turning the belt into a gauntlet of flying bombs. Jupiter's moons were converted into missile platforms, their surfaces bristling with launch tubes aimed outward at the dark. Mars became a fortress. Its orbital stations were reinforced, its defense satellites activated, its surface installations hardened against bombardment. The civilian population was evacuated underground into shelters that had been built decades ago, during a period of human history when they feared invasion from exactly this kind of threat. And Earth itself, humanity's small blue home in the void, activated its orbital defense grid for the first time. The grid was ugly. It had been built over 40 years by dozens of different nations, with different engineering standards and different ideas about what an orbital weapon should look like. Were sleek and modern. Others were blocky and industrial, and a few looked like they had been designed by someone who had watched too many science fiction movies as a child. But together they formed a web of overlapping fire zones that covered the entire planet. While the military prepared for war, a different kind of breakthrough was happening in the science labs aboard the Defiance. Dr. Lena Okafor was a xenobiologist who had spent her career studying extremophile organisms in Earth's deep oceans, and she had been assigned to analyze hollow-tide tissue samples recovered from the Battle of the Charnel Line. What she found changed everything. The adaptation is not purely biological, she announced to a room full of human and hegemony scientists, her dark eyes bright with the energy of someone who had not slept in 3 days. It is networked. Every bioship is connected to the Queen Mind through a form of quantum biological resonance. Weapon. The information is transmitted to the entire swarm simultaneously. That is how they adapt so fast. She pulled up a diagram on the display. But the connection is the weakness. If we can disrupt it, if we can cut individual ships off from the network, they lose access to the collective adaptation. They become isolated, and an isolated hollow-tide organism is no smarter than a particularly aggressive fungus. The room erupted in conversation, and within hours, a joint team of human, Droon, and Luron scientists was working around the clock on a jamming system. They called it the Shroud. It combined human electromagnetic warfare technology, crude but powerful, with Droon crystalline resonance amplifiers that could broadcast on quantum frequencies, and Luron empathic disruption fields that targeted the biological components of the hollow-tide's communication network. The hegemony engineers said it should not work. Incompatible. The frequency ranges did not overlap. The power requirements were impossible. The human engineers looked at the equations, looked at the hegemony engineers, and then spent 36 hours awake, on coffee and stubbornness, rewiring the entire system until it worked anyway. How? Asked the lead Droon engineer, staring at the functional prototype. We moved some wires around, said the lead human engineer, a woman named Petrov, who had grease on her face and a screwdriver behind her ear. On the 19th day, the hollow tide arrived. It came out of FTL like a wall of darkness, 100,000 bioships blotting out the stars, their hulls pulsing with hungry light, stretching across a front so wide that the sensors could not display the entire formation on a single screen. At the center of the swarm was the World Eater, a single organism larger than any ship the hegemony had ever built, kilometers across, a living mountain of dark flesh, and bone and teeth that existed for one purpose and one purpose only, to consume worlds. Vasquez stood on the bridge of the Defiance, and looked at the display, and felt the weight of 8 billion lives on Earth pressing down on her shoulders. All ships, she said, Weapons free. The battle for Sol began. The asteroid belt gauntlet claimed thousands of bioships in the first hour. Proximity mines detonated in chains, and weaponized asteroids tore through swarm formations, and the hollow tide bled as it pushed through. But it kept coming, and the swarm was vast enough to absorb the losses, and still outnumber the defenders by 10-1. At Jupiter, the moon-based missile platforms fired everything they had. Wave after wave of warheads slammed into the advancing fleet mass, and bioships died by the hundreds. But the hollow tide adapted, growing thicker armor on its forward elements, and the missiles began to do less damage with each volley. The fortress held for 6 hours before the sheer weight of the swarm overwhelmed the orbital stations. The last transmission from the Mars Defense Command was a single word, repeated 3 times. Still fighting, still fighting, still fighting. The hollow tide reached Earth's orbit, and the sky above every continent turned red with the light of burning bioships and exploding defense satellites. The orbital grid fired everything it had, and the space above the planet became a hell of energy beams and missile trails and detonating organisms. And then Vasquez gave the order. Activate the shroud. The shroud fired, a wave of disruption that rippled outward from 12 emitter stations positioned around Earth, and the effect was immediate and devastating. Vast sections of the holotide swarm went dark. Bioships lost contact with the Queen Mind, lost their coordination, lost their adaptive intelligence. They drifted and collided and began attacking each other. In mindless animal panic, human and hegemony ships tore into the isolated clusters, destroying thousands of organisms that could no longer defend themselves. But the Queen Mind was ancient and powerful, and it pushed back. It focused its will, burning through the disruption with sheer force, re-establishing connections to its most powerful elements. And it drove a spearhead of its strongest bioships directly through the shroud toward Earth. The World Eater led the charge. It broke through the final defense line, shrugging off weapons fire that would have destroyed a continent, and it opened its vast maw and turned toward the blue world below. Vasquez watched it come, and she made her decision in the space of a single heartbeat. "Helm, put us in its path," she said. "All ships that can still fight, form on the Defiance. We are going to kill that thing or die in front of it." She opened the fleet channel one more time. Not one step further, not 1 inch of sky. The Defiance surged forward, and behind it came every ship that still had power and weapons. Battered human destroyers, and damaged hegemony cruisers, and tiny fighters that had no business being in the same space as a World Eater. And they threw themselves at the creature with everything they had left. Marine boarding teams landed on its surface and began cutting. Fighters flew into the gaps in its armor and detonated. Ships fired at point-blank range until their weapons melted and then rammed their hulls into its flesh. The bridge of the Defiance shook so hard that Vasquez had to grip the railing to stay on her feet, and sparks rained from the ceiling, and damage reports screamed from every console. And then, slowly, impossibly, the World Eater began to die. It shuddered, a tremor that ran through its entire body, and its bioluminescence flickered, and it began to drift, pulled by Saturn's gravity. Dark blood and debris across the void. It crashed into Saturn's rings, in a bloom of frozen gore that spread across 10,000 kilometers, and the ring of ice and rock and dust turned dark with the blood of a dead god. The remaining hollow tide forces, cut off from the Queen Mind's focus, scattered and fled into the dark, and the human and hegemony ships hunted them down, one by one. Earth survived. Vasquez sat down in her captain's chair for the first time in 14 hours, and she looked out at the battered sky above her homeworld, and she allowed herself to close her eyes for just a moment. Somewhere in the dark beyond Sol, the Queen Mind recoiled. It had lost a World Eater. It had lost tens of thousands of ships. It had been driven back from a single tiny world by creatures that should not have been able to resist it for even an hour. And for the first time in its ancient, endless existence, the Queen Mind felt something cold settle into the core of its being. Fear. The hollow tide retreated across the charnel line for the first time in 30 years, and the galaxy did not know how to react. On 100 worlds, on stations and colonies and refugee ships scattered across hegemony space, the news arrived in fragments. Sensor reports, fleet communications, shaky video recordings taken from the bridges of ships that had fought at Sol, and the reaction was the same everywhere. Silence first, then disbelief, then something that most of these species had forgotten how to feel. The Droon philosopher generals went still for days, their crystal bodies cycling through colors no one had ever seen before, processing what had happened through their ancient analytical frameworks, and finding that none of their frameworks could contain it. The HFY War calculators ran their models again and again, searching for the error that would explain how a species with 40 years of spaceflight had done what 1,000 years of hegemony had not. Military tradition could not. They found no error. The math simply did not account for what humans were. The Luran empaths gathered in their great water halls and wept, but for the first time in a generation, they wept with something other than grief. High Concordant Ashaya made the journey to Earth personally, aboard a small diplomatic vessel with a minimal escort. She did not want ceremony, she said. She wanted to see. Earth was scarred. Orbital debris still burned in the upper atmosphere, drawing lines of fire across the night sky that the humans had already begun calling war stars. The wreckage of bioships and defense satellites rained down and controlled deorbits, and the oceans were scattered with the dark remains of holotide organisms that had fallen through the defense grid. But Earth was alive. Ashaya walked through the streets of a coastal city called Lisbon, and she saw buildings with broken windows already being repaired by crews of humans who worked through the night. She saw children playing in a park beneath a sky still streaked with the scars of battle. She saw an old woman sitting on a bench feeding birds, as if nothing had happened. And when the woman looked up and saw Ashaya, a 7-foot alien with 4 silver eyes and skin like polished stone, she smiled and waved. "Welcome to Earth," the woman said. "Are you hungry? I have bread." Ashaya stopped walking, and something broke open inside her chest, and she had to take a moment before she could continue. She visited the memorial that was being built along the waterfront, a wall of names, thousands of them, each one a person who had died in the defense of Sol, and she stood before it for a long time and read every name she could, sounding them out in her mind, trying to give each one the weight it deserved. She met engineers who showed her the wreckage of the shroud emitters with pride, pointing out the places where they had jury-rigged alien technology together with human ingenuity and held it in place with what they cheerfully described as hope and duct tape. She met Marines who had walked on the skin of a world-eater and cut it apart with hand tools, and who spoke about it with the casual disbelief of people who still could not quite accept what they had done. She met children who drew pictures of spaceships and aliens, and asked her if she wanted to see their drawings, and she said yes, and she looked at every single one. And everywhere she went, she was struck by the same thing: how small they were. Humans were small, fragile, short-lived, soft-bodied creatures who could be killed by a fall, a disease, a sharp edge, or simply by their own biology giving out after a handful of decades. They had no natural armor, no innate weapons, no telepathy, no crystalline memory structures, no hive coordination. They had nothing except each other, and the stubborn, inexplicable refusal to stop. Back on the pale vigil, the hegemony scientists and philosophers began producing studies and papers about humanity at an almost frantic pace, as if they were trying to understand something sacred before it disappeared. The Droon named them the Paradox species, beings who contained within themselves the capacity for both limitless cruelty and limitless compassion, and who chose between them every single day, not by instinct, not by programming, not by the dictates of their biology, but by choice, by will, by a moral architecture that they had built for themselves out of nothing but pain and time. The Luran empaths wrote the most poetic descriptions. They said that touching a human mind was like standing in a storm that was somehow also a hearth, a place of impossible contradictions, where rage and tenderness existed in the same breath, where grief and hope were braided together so tightly that you could not separate them without destroying. They feel everything, the Luran High Empath wrote in her report. Every emotion at full intensity, all the time, with no filter and no dampener. By every model we have, this should drive them insane. Instead, it drives them forward. Meanwhile, Dr. Okafor continued her research into the Hollow Tide, and what she found changed the shape of the war. The Queen Mind was old, older than any civilization in the hegemony, older perhaps than the hegemony itself. And buried deep in its biological archives, preserved in layers of genetic memory, was a truth that no one had expected. The Hollow Tide had not always been a swarm. Millennia ago, it had been a species, a civilization even, a people who had lived on a world in a distant part of the galaxy, and who had looked up at the stars and felt alone. They had called out, just as the hegemony had called out, sending signals into the void, begging for contact, for companionship, for proof that they were not alone. The only living things in an empty universe. No one had answered. And over centuries of silence, something in them had broken. Loneliness had curdled into hunger, and hunger had become consumption, and consumption had become the only thing they knew. They had lost their individuality, their culture, their names. They had become the Hollow Tide, filling the emptiness inside themselves by devouring everything outside themselves. Eshaya read the report and sat alone in her chambers for a long time, and she thought about the beacon of last asking, and about what might have happened to the hegemony if no one had answered their call. The parallel was not subtle, and it terrified her. Vasquez read the same report and said, "Then we do not just fight it, we talk to it." The operation was called Open Hand, and it was the most ambitious undertaking in galactic history. A combined military and scientific mission to push deep into Hollow Tide territory, through the outer swarms, and reach the Queen Mind itself. Not to destroy it, but to offer it what it had never been given. An answer. The fleet that launched was the largest ever assembled. Hegemony warships and human vessels flying side by side, supported by Droon resonance ships and Luran empathic amplifiers and Kelvari tactical coordinators. Every species in the hegemony contributed, and at the tip of the spear was the Defiance, still scarred from the siege of Sol, still carrying the crew that had refused to give up their sky. The battles on the way in were savage. The Hollow Tide fought harder the closer the fleet got to the Queen Mind. But humanity fought with the same unpredictable fury that had broken the swarm at the charnel line, and the hegemony fought with a renewed ferocity born of something they had not felt in decades. Hope. When they reached the Queen Mind, a vast biological structure the size of a small moon, pulsing with dark light, in the void between stars, the Luran empaths and Droon resonance specialists activated a communication array built specifically for this moment. And they spoke to it. They told it that the silence was over, that it was not alone, that it did not have to consume to feel whole. The Queen Mind was too old and too broken to be saved entirely. Too much of what it had been was gone, dissolved into the swarm over millennia of hungry emptiness. But deep inside it, older than the hunger, fragments of the original species heard the message and responded. The Hollow Tide began to fracture, Some swarms went dormant, drifting into dark space like sleeping giants. Others retreated to the edges of the galaxy, their aggression fading as the Queen Mind's control weakened. A few fought on mindlessly, disconnected remnants that would take years to hunt down, but they were manageable now. The existential threat was over. 6 months later, HFY stood before the Galactic Assembly, a new body that included all 7 hegemony species and, for the first time, humanity. In a great hall built in orbit above Earth, with windows that looked down on the small blue world that had changed everything. She spoke about the war, about the losses, about the dead worlds and the consumed civilizations, and the long years of despair. And then she spoke about the signal, and the answer, and the species that had come running from the edge of nowhere to fight a war that was not theirs. She turned to Admiral Vasquez, who sat among the human delegation in a simple uniform, the scar on her face catching the light. And she asked the question that the entire galaxy wanted answered. "Why?" HFY said, and her voice carried across the great hall and across the frequencies that broadcast to 1,000 worlds. "You did not know us. You owed us nothing. Your world was safe and distant, and the hollow tide might never have reached you. Come." The hall was silent. Vasquez looked at HFY for a long time, and then she looked out the window at Earth below, the small, scarred, impossibly stubborn world that had sent its children into the dark to save strangers. And she said, "Because we know what it is like to cry out and hear nothing, and we swore a long time ago that if we ever heard someone else calling, we would answer." The hall was silent for 1 heartbeat, then 2. And then the Droon ambassador rose, his crystal body blazing with white light. And the Kelvari war commander rose, her wings spread wide. And the Lurin empath rose, her skin shimmering with every color of joy she knew. And one by one, every representative of every species in the assembly rose to their feet. And the silence became something else, something larger and warmer and more enduring than any sound could be. Across the galaxy, on 1,000 worlds, in 1,000 languages, the story was told of the day the stars went dark, and the old civilizations cried out for help and heard only silence in return. All except for one voice, young, crude, unpolished, and impossibly brave, from a small blue world orbiting an unremarkable star at the edge of nowhere. They were not the strongest, not the wisest, not the oldest. They were fragile and contradictory and reckless, and they had nearly destroyed themselves 12 times before they ever reached the stars. But when they heard a stranger crying in the dark, they came. Not because they were asked, not because they were ready, not because they owed anyone anything, because that is what humans do.